Hey there. Are you ready to dive into some fascinating, maybe a little unsettling territory?
Oh, definitely.
We're going to be examining a sermon transcript, and it focuses on how to recognize, they call it the devil's playbook,
Okay. Mm.
basically how societies might be manipulated. And what's really interesting is how it links these tactics all the way back to Nazi Germany.
How so?
Well, it connects those historical events to things that are happening today, and it argues that, by looking for these patterns in history, we can actually be more aware and understand um, how certain tactics, might be playing out right now.
It's like, history often rhymes.
It makes you think twice about what you see online, what you see on the news, you know.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, before we go any further, I think it's important to say that, we're going to approach this with a critical eye.
Of course. But
We're here to kind of unpack these ideas that are presented in the sermon, not to endorse any particular viewpoint.
it's about empowering you, the listener, to form your own opinion.
Exactly. Okay. So let's get into it. So the sermon lays out these four plays
Hmm.
that it claims are used to manipulate societies. And get this, it argues that these plays are like reappearing in modern times. So first up is contradict the truth.
Which is basically what it sounds like. Just start to question, establish knowledge and erode the public trust in
Uh,
institutions. The sermon even compares it to the serpent questioning God in the Garden of Eden.
wow. So they're suggesting that just like the serpent tempted Eve with doubt,
Hmm.
that there are forces today that are trying to make us question the media experts, even religious leaders.
Right, yeah.
It makes you wonder how much distrust is intentional versus like genuine shortcomings of institutions.
That is a question, isn't it? And it leads right into play number two, control the news narrative.
Okay.
So if you can control like the information that people have access to,
Yeah,
then you're able to influence how they view the world around them.
right.
And the sermon is arguing that this is done through a constant barrage of misinformation, which makes it really difficult to separate fact from fiction.
So it's not even just about controlling the information, but it's almost like they're being bombarded with so much of it true and false that it's
Yeah,
like
you don't know what to believe.
you're just confused.
It's like that Tower of Babel where, that single distorted narrative leads to confusion and chaos.
It's almost like they're saying that today's media landscape, because there is so much potential for bias, so much potential for misinformation, that it's like a digital Tower of Babel,
Exactly.
which is kind of a scary thought. And I think in that kind of environment where trust is eroded and information is unreliable, it's much easier to exploit those existing tensions.
Oh, absolutely.
Which leads us to play number three, bring conflict to groups.
Yeah, turning people against each other, especially, using existing divisions that are maybe racial, political, social.
They actually quote Abraham Lincoln in this. They say, a house divided against itself cannot stand.
Which is true. Divide and conquer is a tactic as old as time. You sow discord among, everybody, and then those in power are more easily able to maintain control and advance their own agendas.
Okay, so let's just say for a second that those first three plays have done their job, right? People are distrustful, they're confused, and now they're at each other's throats. That's where the fourth play comes in, convert the youth.
This is where it gets a little dark, because if the groundwork has been laid, now you have these young minds that are much more easily influenced.
And it's not even necessarily like a direct indoctrination, although they do mention that, like the Nazi youth programs and things like that.
Right.
But it's like these more subtle ways that these ideologies are disseminated, even in modern debate about education.
It makes you wonder what messages are, young people being exposed to inside the classroom and outside the classroom, and how that's shaping their worldview.
So we've got these four plays, contradicting the truth, controlling that narrative, creating that conflict,
Yeah.
and then converting the youth.
Hmm.
And the sermon is arguing that this is a recurring pattern that we see throughout history. But is it really that simple? Are we really seeing these same patterns, like repeating themselves in the 21st century?
Well, that's the question, isn't it? And to kind of illustrate their point, the sermon uses this really stark example from history, Nazi Germany.
Yeah, and this is where it gets, I think, really chilling, because they're saying that the rise of the Nazi Party, the suppression of dissent, the persecution of Jewish people, they're saying it wasn't just this like series of horrific events, but a calculated strategy that had followed these four plays.
Like they use very specific examples to back up their claim, for example. Even before Hitler's election, they highlight how he really grasped that power of propaganda, of controlling the narrative.
Right, and it's not even like he just won an election outright. It was this series of political maneuvers and exploiting this climate of fear and uncertainty that was already kind of brewing in Germany.
Exactly. The sermon really emphasizes how Hitler and the Nazi Party, they were very good at creating a narrative that resonated with people who were feeling vulnerable, who were feeling disillusioned.
So how does this tie back to those 4 plays we talked about?
Well, take the Reichstag fire, for example. That event, which, many historians believe was actually orchestrated by the Nazis themselves, really played into this whole narrative of fear and instability that they were creating.
Oh, wow.
So they were able to point the finger at political opponents, paint them as this threat to national security, and then that justifies them cracking down on civil liberties.
Exactly. It's like they're controlling the narrative,
Yeah.
right? You create a crisis, whether it's real or perceived, and then you get to swoop in and present yourself as the only one with a solution.
They even quote Benjamin Franklin. They say, those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety.
Which, that's a powerful quote, and I think it's relevant no matter what time period we're talking
It
about.
really is. Because it highlights this tension that we see over and over again throughout history between the rights of an individual and then the security of, the collective. And that's something that every society grapples with, but especially during times of crisis.
Yeah, and it makes you think twice about how much we are willing to give up in the name of safety, in the name of security.
Mhm.
And, the sermon doesn't stop there. It goes on to connect these tactics to more recent events and even social and political movements.
Right. It gets a little bit, sensitive here because they start to connect the Nazis' use of propaganda and scapegoating to contemporary discussions about race and social justice.
Okay.
Specifically, they point to the Black Lives Matter movement and critical race theory, and they're arguing that while those movements obviously have very different goals, and they're happening in a completely different context than Nazi Germany.
That maybe they share some similarities in terms of
Yeah.
how they approach things, like when it comes to identifying and, demonizing what they perceive as these oppressive forces.
Right, and it seems like they're suggesting that there's a pattern of using, emotionally charged language and these historical comparisons that are meant to stir up division and advance a particular agenda.
So it's not necessarily saying that Black Lives Matter or critical race theory are equivalent to Nazism, but more that they're employing some of those similar tactics of, persuasion and mobilization.
Exactly, and I think this is where it becomes really crucial for us as critical thinkers to be nuanced in how we approach these claims, right? It's one thing to say that these tactics of manipulation have been used throughout history across different ideologies, but it's another to draw these direct comparisons between things that are happening in such different contexts.
So we have to be careful not to draw these false equivalences or use these historical comparisons to try to shut down important conversations about race, about inequality, about social justice. But at the same time, we can't just ignore these uncomfortable parallels. We can't just dismiss them out of hand.
Right. Absolutely. And I think this is where this part of the sermon, while potentially controversial, it brings up these important questions about how we engage with history and the narratives that we use to try to understand the world around us. It challenges us to be more discerning about the information we're consuming and to engage in these conversations, even when they're difficult, in a respectful but critical way.
So we've gone through all these really heavy historical parallels, and I feel like now the sermon kind of shifts gears a bit, goes from these cautionary tales to almost like a message of hope or a call to action.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting how they frame it. It's not just about recognizing those tactics, but also like having the courage to confront them, to be what they call like a good shepherd, protecting the flock from the wolves.
Right? It's almost like they're saying, don't just sit back and let this happen.
Exactly.
And they have this very powerful analogy to kind of drive that point home. They're talking about, imagine there's a train full of people, and it's passing right by a church, and everybody on that train is oblivious to the cries of those suffering inside.
Wow.
And that's how they describe people who kind of just blindly follow these harmful ideologies.
Oh, that's heavy.
It is. And they contrast that with the story of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was a pastor, and he actively resisted the Nazi regime, and he was eventually executed for his beliefs.
Oh, wow.
But he represents, the opposite of that indifference, right? It's the courage to actually stand up for what you believe in, even if it means making a huge personal sacrifice.
And knowing that there are consequences to your actions.
Right. And they're saying that silence, especially when it comes to injustice, it can almost be a form of complicity.
Yeah.
And they want people to be more than just passive observers of what's going on in the world around them, but to actually try to participate in shaping a more just and equitable society.
And it's risky, right?
Yeah.
They fully acknowledge that when you start to challenge power structures, when you call out injustice, it comes at a price.
Yeah.
And they share the story of the Ten Boom family to illustrate this point.
The Ten Boom family, remind me who they were again.
So they were Dutch Christians, and they hid Jewish people during the Holocaust.
Oh, right.
And they were eventually discovered and sent to concentration camps for it.
Wow.
Which is a very stark reminder that, when you take a moral stand, there can be really, really serious consequences. But I think it also highlights just the immense courage it takes to choose to do so anyway.
Yeah, and I mean, it sounds like the sermon really wants people to see the Ten Boom family as, like, the epitome of what it means to be a true shepherd. Putting yourself at risk to protect other people, to fight for what's right no matter what it costs you personally.
Right, and it's not even, always about those, huge acts of heroism either. It's about, we can all be shepherds in our own way, in our own lives.
It's less about, single-handedly taking down this tyrannical regime.
Yeah.
It's more about just being vigilant in our everyday lives.
Exactly. It could be speaking out against injustice that you see happening in your community, or it could be as simple as, when you see misinformation being shared online, you challenge it.
Right.
Or even just having those tough conversations with your family and your friends who might have different views than you do. It's about not shying away from those difficult conversations, but really thoughtfully and courageously engaging with the world around you.
So being informed, questioning what you see and hear, not being afraid to actually use your voice.
Exactly.
Okay, and I think it's important to point out, even though this sermon is obviously coming from a very specific religious context, I think that message about personal responsibility and, having moral courage kind of transcends any particular belief system.
It does. It speaks to this, I think, innate human desire to do good in the world, to make a difference.
So as we kind of wrap up our deep dive here, we want to leave you with a couple questions to consider.
Yeah.
Did any of those historical parallels, do they resonate with you in a new way?
How do you see these tactics playing out, either in your own life or in the world around you?
And maybe the most important question is, what steps, even if they're small, can you take to try to be a force for good? To push back against that darkness in a world that can feel really chaotic and uncertain.
So much to unpack there.
Yeah, we hope this conversation has given you some things to think about, maybe even inspired you to take some action.
Absolutely.
Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged.